why is he doing this? If he doesn't need Hochul's endorsement, then why the fuck seek it in the first place? Her purpose in going to Munich was not to speak to the global audience of the working class. Her purpose was to show them that, hey, I can be your guy. What on earth is Chomsky doing?
It is insane that you're the only person that's using leverage and trying to exact leverage and force people with the reality of where popular opinion is with your electoral campaign.
That is not using leverage. That is a person who is eager to be part of the establishment. I am not looking to meet these people.
Woody Allen and Steve Bannon. And
oh my God, yeah. I did not, first of all, Woody Allen is disgusting. It's about showing that you can be part of the Western imperialism club.
Don't bother eulogizing me like this when the time comes. The less said, the better. Are you having flashbacks to your last race? I mean, did you feel like you kind of snuck in under the radar the way that AOC did before all of the progressives started to win? Absolutely. And avoided not. Some of the No.
We the only thing that you can say that was true in 2013 was that it was such a novelty. Like, I was the first socialist in 100 years, practically, like a self-declared revolutionary socialist running. The Democratic Party initially underestimated us, but to be honest with you, the attacks were never absent. It was only a question of how high profile they became. Like, so throughout, even when we were, everybody, all the bourgeois thought we were nobodies and they didn't need to worry about us, we were still being attacked by the labor bureaucracy. I mean, they would hold rallies, for example, against wage theft, and we would be there supporting it because obviously, we're socialists, and I was a union member myself at that time. I was a delegate to the Labor Council. They all knew me. They supported our opponent who had voted against paid sick leave and who was opposing $15 an hour at that time. And they would like almost physically bar me from even standing near their press conference. It was pretty bad. They were always bad. I think we take it as a badge of honor. We take it as a reflection of the bureaucrats knowing exactly who we are and why they should fear our politics. So,
when you were in the union, realizing that your union members were choosing to endorse your opponent who didn't stand for the basics of living wage and the kinds of things you were advocating for in the context of your union. I mean, I don't know that we've ever really talked about what that experience was like and what it was like, what kind of excuses they offered you to your face, what that kind of interpersonal dynamic was like, and how you managed to ultimately overcome their unwillingness to break from the establishment, even though their ideology clearly aligned with yours. Essentially.
No. I mean, I think that's a really interesting note you ended your question on, because I don't think that their ideology aligns with ours in the sense that I think we're not talking about the rank and file so much as the leadership of the union. And I don't want to be simplistic in the sense that, the confusions and the corruption in thought doesn't just affect the people who are in leadership. It affects, the labor movement as a whole needs a reckoning. That is true. But even noting that, you can still see the massive divide between just overall rank and file opinion and overall leadership opinion. Overwhelmingly the leadership of the labor movement right now, and we call them trade union bureaucrats for the reason, because it is a bureaucracy, they are very much tied to the establishment. And really, in some ways, some of the top union leaders, they are part of the establishment. Like, I don't think you can say Liz Schuller and Randy Weingarten are supporting the establishment. They are the lower rungs of the establishment. I mean, that is who they are. They are absolute class enemies of the working class. But what did happen, and this goes to your question about how did we break their opposition, is that the rank and file of the union movement started supporting us tremendously. So, like, the rank and file of my union, AFT, they were strongly in support of our campaign. They would come out to our rallies. They would talk to me. They would email me. And in fact, the leader of my union, the president of my union, wasn't really opposed to us, but she was not willing to stick her neck out either in the whole context of the labor bureaucracy. But it was the leaders of SEIU and UFCW. These were the main unions, and then Teamsters, and all the construction trades they're practically reactionary right-wing guys. They were all opposed to us, and but what they couldn't do is stop us from fighting for what we were fighting for. And that is one of the reasons we have taken up the electoral route. People have this simplistic idea of, oh, not electoral but movement, but that doesn't make sense. You're faced with the same obstacles everywhere, so our job is to look for the massive amount of breakthrough wherever we can. And so this avenue, running for the city council, offered us the avenue where the labor leaders would be all bent out of shape. I mean, they would, every time I was at the table, and I was out there virtually every day. I campaigned myself every day, and they would come up to me and say, "How dare you talk about 15? You didn't check with us." And I'm like, "Why should I check with you? It's my campaign. If you don't want to support it, you explain it to your members. Why the fuck you won't support 15 when it is becoming so hugely popular? You tell your members why you, as a union leader, are not supporting it, but you don't have the right to come and tell me." So that's the thing. Running our campaign gave us the ability to do what we thought was made sense for the working class, that would give a breakthrough. And the union members just really, really gravitated towards their demand. I mean, inside our organization, we had a big debate. There were some leaders, actually far more experienced than me, who didn't agree with us, with those of us who were arguing that 15 should be the flagship demand. We just had an idea that this demand is what's capturing the imagination, and this is what we should make the most prominent. And we were dead right. It's not that we will always be right, but we were dead right on the idea of 15 being the most prominent demand, because it just caught fire. And then everybody had to come in line. The two mayoral candidates, both of them corporate guys, they were very close. It was a close race. And one of the things that decided who got ahead was the guy who blinked faster, said, I'm supporting 15. But, that was at the very end of the election cycle. But we were attacked every which way. I mean, in the last days, when the establishment knew that, wow, these people have a chink of daylight and they can actually win, they decided to launch a misogynist attack on me, which completely backfired on them.
I mean, that I think is a really good sort of backdrop for getting into today's episode and some of the topics that I know that we wanted to explore, including how Zohran Mamdani's first months are going. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's been some controversy around this initial budget he's proposed and some comparisons between the need to meet the budget demands of New York City without cutting the NYPD. It's been compared to the Doge effort and finding the need to find efficiencies, some of which have come at the expense of programs that the left were very upset about being cut when it was Eric Adams cutting it, including the New York City library system. Of course, the backdrop to this that I find myself thinking about as you recount what you went through in your run against the establishment in Seattle is the fact that he has to negotiate with Kathy Hochul, who is the current governor of New York, who up until a week or two ago had a challenger in her former lieutenant governor, Antonio Delgado, who's been on the show. He recently, right before dropping out, had recruited India Walton, who was a DSA socialist candidate who had won the mayoral primary in Buffalo, New York, about 4 years prior, only to be upset by a write-in campaign by the incumbent and losing in the general. A lot of really interesting parallels to Zohran Mamdani's race. Anyway, that shaped it to be an interesting sort of ticket insofar as Delgado seemed to be making an open bid to a left sort of a lane. Not, I would say, a longstanding leftist himself by any means, but someone who clearly saw an opportunity for, offering a more sympathetic perspective, a more sympathetic relationship with Zohran and supporting his policies than Hochul, who has at times been openly hostile to any number of things, including pro-Palestine protesters, any efforts to reel in the NYPD, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's been back and forth, right? Are we, as the left, are people like myself being insufficiently understanding with respect to what Zohran is up against, and giving him insufficient credit for having negotiated with Hochul to secure funding for his universal pre-K program. Let's call that his flagship agenda item. Or does the fact that so many leftists are, for obvious reasons, invested in Zohran, and so many leftists have been recruited to actually work for his campaign, is that preventing us from levying legitimate criticisms and pushing him in the direction that he should be pushed to maximize the benefit of him being in that office?
I think that every gain we can get through working class organizing needs to be celebrated and welcomed. So any improvement in funding for childcare is crucial. However, I think saying or thinking that somehow this is a story about how, oh, this approach can work, for Mamdani to not build a movement using his mayoral office, his international superstar status, but instead make these backroom negotiations with run-of-the-mill corporate Democrat Kathy Hochul, is somehow that is the gold standard. That is where the problem lies. When you make that the metric, then it leads you astray because that is the wrong metric. The metric we need to have is what is it that the working class needs to do today in order to shut down ICE terror? What does it need to do in order to end the genocide and end all US military funding? What do we need in order to win free healthcare for all, free childcare for all, free buses, $30 an hour minimum wage, and all the other needs that we are that we desperately, all the services and all the infrastructure and all the urgent tasks that we need to do in order to secure even a decent, just halfway decent standard of living, all of which obviously requires taxing the rich. I mean, taxing the rich has to be a focal point. As a socialist, obviously, as you know, I would say that we can't stop there. We need revolutionary movements and need to take corporations into democratic public ownership and run the society in, by workers and in the interest of the planet. But at this moment, the least that we need to fight for and accomplish is the substantial, massive taxes on the wealthy in order to begin funding our needs, which are grossly underfunded. So having the correct framework for analysis is super crucial, because if you have the wrong framework, it can lead you to a completely erroneous conclusion. And that is why I don't agree with people who say, well, isn't this a path forward? Yeah, to win a little bit of childcare? No, that is not the path we should be looking for, is my point. Because if we were to have fighters in office, in the way that we used my city council office for 10 years, you can win a million times more. And it's not only about what you win, it's about how you win. So the example that we set in Seattle of using an elected office as a working class fighter, not as somebody who goes and negotiates with Democrats, but who is very clear that the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, is a party of capitalism. And when I go to City Hall or US Congress, they're not my colleagues. The Republicans and Democrats are not my colleagues. They are class enemies of the working class, and that I'm going to use my office to build movements. Then we can win enormous victories. And that is why, when people say, oh, look at the childcare, I say, look at the highest minimum wage. Look at the Amazon tax. Look at the unprecedented renters' rights that we won that most cities don't have, like a $10 rent late fee cap. So my point is, even if your metric was what we won, this approach will pale in comparison to what you can win with a fighting strategy that Mamdani is refusing to adopt, which is not a surprise. This is what I pointed out before he was elected. However, even that is not enough to look at in terms of what lens we use. It also has to be how you win things. And so with a fighting strategy, not only do you win a million times more what's possible through some guy at the top making some backroom deals with the establishment, it is, if you win it through building movements and setting an example of what the working class should demand from elected representatives, then you have offered far more, because then you set the stage, you help set the stage for future victories. All of this needs to be taken into account. And if you use that framework, the answer is no, that is not the solution. And furthermore, you have to place that one thing that he has done also in the context of all his other betrayals. Reappointing Jessica Tisch, arch Zionist, reactionary policing lieutenant, back as the commissioner of the NYPD. He has endorsed Kathy Hochul, as you said. She is also an arch Zionist. She is, as I said, a garden variety corporate Democrat. There's nothing remarkable about him. This is what the Democratic Party does. She has made it very clear she's opposed to taxing the rich. And she recently acted as a strike breaker against the nurses' strike by issuing and then repeatedly renewing an executive order that made it easier for the hospital bosses to hire scab nurses during that strike. That is a very common strike breaking tactic that bosses use. And so he did all of this. And then on top of that, he just announced a budget, a preliminary budget, whatever assessment, where he has announced $94 million for continuing the surveillance apparatus of New York City. I mean, this is what they call the domain awareness system. It is a $3 billion Microsoft-based surveillance network that blankets the 5 boroughs. It's called the Ring of Steel. That's the colloquial terminology for it, because it is so solid. It's like everywhere you go, like practically if you move on the streets, even the just local patrol officers, they can piece together data from all these roadside cameras and all of that to literally trace your movements throughout the day. And even in ordinary circumstances, this should be chilling for people under capitalism, but we're not even under the ordinarily horrifying circumstances under capitalism. We are right now in the midst of ICE terror. And in fact, the data reveals that ICE heavily relies on local agencies, and ICE arrests are substantially greater in the cities where city, county, and state and police licensing and other departments cooperate with and share data with ICE. So all this surveillance, data that's being collected, that is not just sitting there for no reason. That is there to be used by different institutions of the capitalist state. And right now, obviously, the biggest danger is posed, most emergent danger is posed by ICE. And just to be specific about New York, agreements between ICE and local law enforcement agencies increased by an eye-popping 950% last year. This is in the context of New York State having a Democratic governor, a Democratic Party majority in both houses of the state legislature, and on top of that, 8 of the state Democrats being from the Democratic Socialists of America. And yet, over the last year, after Trump took office, 9 memorandums of agreement have been signed with ICE by New York State alone, encompassing 6 different counties. And so, as a result, and this is not an abstract intellectual point, this is as a result of the combination of the surveillance infrastructure, the data being shared with ICE, all of that, thousands upon thousands of New York immigrants have been detained by ICE. So these are real consequences that are being visited upon innocent working people.
So when you say you would prefer that he take a fighting strategy, what do you mean by that specifically? I will say from my perspective, I was sort of surprised that he didn't make more of an effort to exploit the fact that there is an election that Kathy Hochul needs to win. I understand the pushback is she's a shoo-in, Delgado didn't stand a chance, yada, yada, yada. That argument is a little weak to me, given that very similar arguments were made about Zohran around this time last year, and so many others who have broken through, and how popular Zohran is, and how much he might have been able to move the needle if he were to have even flirted with throwing his hat behind an opponent, and that he could have extracted leverage out of that scenario, even if he ultimately did choose to endorse Kathy Hochul. That's what kind of springs to mind, especially when I heard you say at the start of this episode that you felt like the mayoral candidates had to adopt $15 minimum wage as something that they supported because of the popularity around the issue that you had helped to generate and expose. So that's what springs to mind, that Zohran could similarly use the fact that he's popular and taxing the rich is very popular to put pressure on Kathy Hochul because she's vulnerable, ostensibly, in an election year. Is that something that you would consider to be part of a fighting strategy? And if not, what other kinds of things would you like to have seen Zohran do?
So just to start with, when I'm talking about the fighting strategy is in relation to the situation in New York, I want to be clear. I'm not necessarily making a statement about the Delgado Walton candidacy because, and again, I want to be brutally honest here that I don't
Please.
consider them, yeah, I don't consider them any uh, huge alternative because they are also from the DSA mold. And unfortunately, the DSA has now has, they have these prominent elected officials in Zohran Mamdani, who's obviously been very active in DSA. AOC has not necessarily been active in DSA, but she is somebody who's supported by New York DSA. And so these are two internationally known figures. And then in addition to that, there's 250 elected officials total of the DSA right now, and they haven't actually used their positions to build any fighting movements. And I'll come to that in a second, what I mean by that. But they haven't. And so it can't be about, and it has never been, and I've always been very clear about this, it can't be, and it shouldn't be about accumulating numbers of in-name socialists or DSA electeds, because just accumulating the numbers does nothing. I mean, you just have more people who are bending themselves to the Democratic Party. And look at the opposite view of how we had one elected office in Seattle and we completely changed politics. And not just in Seattle. Because of what we won, tens of millions of American workers won massive raises at a time when they're being pummeled by cost of living increases. It's been a crucial lifeline. And so, and unfortunately, and it is unfortunate that we have to continue pointing towards our record on the city council. The reason is not that we're just talking about ourselves. The reason is that there isn't another example, and that's tragic for the working class. We don't want a copyright on the approach we used. We didn't invent this. This is the approach that was used by the Marxists and the Teamsters in the 1934 Minneapolis general strike. These are methods used by the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution. We want more people to use it and win, and we want a real upheaval, a real militant revolt of the American working class. But that hasn't happened, and that is why we have to. It is our obligation. It's our moral and political obligation to point towards what does work for the working class. Our obligation is not to build relations with this or that leader. It is about what's good for the working class. And so, yeah, if you use the strategy that we used, which was not trying to cozy up to the Democrats, but actually use your office as the focal point to bring working people into action, and then that creating fear in the minds of the Democrats, that is the strategy we use. So for example, just to say, and I'll come to what he did with the Hochul endorsement and all of that. I'll come to that in a second. But what the Democrats and the Chamber of Commerce and the billionaires like Jeff Bezos, what they feared in me, it was not me alone. It was what we did, which was, and this is a Bolshevik approach, it's a Marxist approach, which is that we had a Bolshevik, a Marxist revolutionary in office, and we and I say we because it can never be done by one person, but obviously it was crucial that I was one of them because I was the elected. If I was about to sell out and take the easy way out, then all is lost. So yeah, that is pretty crucial. But I also want people to remember that it's that combined with a revolutionary socialist leadership that's collectively operating alongside you as the revolutionary socialist in office. And then all of that in combination with the working class that we were mobilizing. That combination, that is what's lethal against the ruling class. That's what allows you to do the class war back against the ruling class, because it's always class war in one end from the ruling class towards the working class. And the way you turn the tables is through that combination, the leadership and the rank and file being in agreement that we need this type of militant approach, which means not making deals with the Democrats. That strategy did depend significantly on me doing the right thing as well. And one of those was bringing the working class into action. But just having working class in action doesn't help either, because we have lots of protests going on, and those protests are absolutely crucial. We cannot underestimate the importance of protests. Those protests, including the massive protests in Minneapolis to shut down ICE, have put pressure on the Trump administration, but it is not going to be enough. And what is lacking right now is not the anger of people or the willingness of millions to go out and fight. What is lacking is the leadership. And we need, I hope that today we can talk about the horrendous situation we're facing with the labor leadership, which is a crucial part of this story here. But the point is that having an elected representative as the movement had with me, where I was clear that I was not there to make backroom deals with the Democratic Party, but instead, as you said, leverage, that's a very important word here. Instead, push as much as I can using my office and using the movement's energy to put pressure on the Democrats, and for them to see it's clear as day, that if they at that moment, if they opposed 15, that is going to be expensive for their own political careers, especially for those who want to have a sheen of progressiveness, because you raise the crescendo of the movement to a point where the working people are not willing to accept, oh yeah, I agree with you, but we need robust studies, and we need more subcommittees on 15. We cannot pass 15 right now. That is utopian, all of that. Just to say on Mamdani, I think he should be doing all of this. I don't expect that he will do, but this is what elected representatives of working people should be doing, what we did. But the bare minimum that he should be doing is what you said, which is that why is he not willing to even use his leverage to hold his endorsement from Kathy Hochul? And at a time when he is ascending in popularity, why not hold your endorsement and say, I want a promise from you that you will tax the rich when you get elected. I won't endorse the others. I mean, I would never endorse Kathy Hochul in a million years, but if you're going to do that, at the very least, how come you're not even using that leverage? I mean, what does it remind you of, Brianna? It reminds me of force the vote. This is what the message we sent to AOC. Why is the squad giving their vote to Nancy Pelosi as House Speaker for free? Why don't you force a vote on Medicare for all and extract something out of it? Use your numerical balance of power to extract something for the working class. Expose to the working class that, look, these Democrats, dare to vote no on this, so clearly we have to fight back. So that even that bare minimum is missing. I mean, look at the headline in the New York Times a few days ago on February 13th. It says, "Tax the Rich rally is expected to draw a big crowd, but not Mamdani. Mayor Zohran Mamdani has told organizers of the February 25th rally that he's unlikely to attend because he does not want to antagonize Governor Kathy Hochul." That is somebody who claims to represent working people, but is happy to give away all the leverage that working people have by declaring, I don't want to antagonize her. What do you have left then? She has nothing to fear from the working class then in that context.
I'm mystified by it, to be honest. I'm frankly mystified by it. Similarly, I'm glad you brought up the analogy to force the vote, because in that scenario, the purported rationale was that they were keeping their powder dry, that they were reserving their political capital, not kicking the mama bear, as it were, with the hopes that it would redound to their benefit. Ryan Grimm offered that, I think when we were debating this on one podcast or another, in different contexts, that there would be committee appointments that squad members like AOC could conceivably get if they were to sort of play ball. And as we know, she was in fact denied committee appointments in that term and seemed to only be punished for doing the quote unquote right thing by the way of the establishment. And if that analogy holds, again, we don't have this much transparency to what's going on with Zohran, but I really take your citation to that particular article to heart. What little glimpses we do know, is that there does seem to be some attempt to insulate Hochul against her obvious break from popular opinion on this issue of taxing the rich, instead of applying pressure and using the leverage that he has in this moment. And just to put a finer point on that, I don't know if you caught this, but Dave Portnoy of Barstool Sports had a tweet that got a lot of sort of funny quote tweets and interaction, because here's someone who is coming from a conservative perspective who noted the enormous amount of wealth that's accumulating. Specifically, Mets owner Steve Cohen got $3.4 billion and a $3.4 billion payday from his hedge fund last year. And there was a chart that listed the top earners in 2025 in Bloomberg News that included many such 3-point-something billion dollar payouts by various people, including Bill Ackman. He only had a $1 billion payout. And Dave Portnoy quote tweets this and says, "Hey, I think I have a solution for Mamdani. Tax Wall Street people like Steve Cohen who built their fortunes on just on Wall Street 90%. That's not real work to begin with." And it's people were like, yeah, you're not exactly reinventing the wheel here. These wealth taxes that have been offered up over the years by Democrats like Elizabeth Warren are very marginal. Well, hers was what, 2 cents on the dollar over however many millions of dollars, $500 million or whatever it is that you had already accumulated. And even so, there's been an incredible backlash from the Democratic Party elites and establishment over the idea of these programs. So if you've got Portnoy on your side, the question is, why is it that Zohran Mamdani is going out of his way not to put too much pressure on Kathy Hochul? And why is it that Delgado and Walton dropped out immediately after creating their ticket when they did? What kind of pressures are going on behind the scenes? Are there concessions that Zohran has already secured? And if so, why keep those private? Why not advertise them as part of a way to make Hochul actually accountable to them when she actually, upon becoming reelected? None of it makes sense to me, even if I'm trying to read it in the most favorable way as possible to Mamdani.
It's not. It's not. And it's a good question you're asking. What is it that's happening behind the scenes? Like, what are the pressures? I have no doubt that there are massive pressures, even when somebody is well-intentioned. But I think that it would be a mistake to think that somehow Mamdani ever intended to do what we're talking about, which is actually hold Kathy Hochul or the billionaires accountable.
You think so? I mean, I'm open, me, like I'm very much open to that being true, but I do feel like I have to at least moot whether I'm being too cynical in the moment, right? Because before he was elected, there were these gestures to the idea that he was, he delayed his they were playing these kind of endorsement games where it felt at the time like Hochul felt pressure to show up at Zohran's rallies and to give some lip service to Zohran's ideology because she understood that he was the one that had the power and the people behind him. And remember, she showed up at that a rally of his and was like, "Well, I hope all of you young people bring this energy to midterms." I mean, like, there does seem to be this fear, or at least this understanding that they need folks like Zohran, who are very popular within the Democratic Party, to deliver for the Democratic Party in midterms. So there's a kid gloveness that people like Hochul will have around Zohran, and that he seemed to be playing with that and exploiting it prior to him being elected. Am I trying to be too generous in saying that at least at some point it seemed like he understood the power that he had in a way that isn't being reflected, at least outwardly, in his behavior right now?
I think that what actually happened is, yes, I mean, there was there certain pressure on Kathy Hochul to endorse Zohran Mamdani in order to make her own re-election much more assured? Sure. But I don't think that was the main variable there. The main variables were both of them making compromises. So in other words, I don't think that Mamdani, I mean, I have no actual like documentary evidence or anything like that. I was not a fly on the wall. I'm just saying this from my own political analysis. It's not some conspiracy theory or anything. It is my political analysis of how these things break down. It's as simple as that. And so I don't need to know the actual specifics of what happened. My understanding of these situations is that there is no way that Hochul would have endorsed him had they not had a mutual understanding at that moment that he is also going to endorse her. And it was also very clear that he hadn't really got anything from Hochul. Because, you have to ask yourself the question at that moment, he didn't need Hochul's endorsement. He really did not. So why did she do it? He did not, and why did he take it? If I were him, I mean, first of all, whenever I say these things, I end up laughing because if Mamdani was a revolutionary socialist, Hochul would be running a million miles away from endorsing him. In my case, it's the opposite. The Democrats were almost getting ready to pop the champagne when they thought I was going to be recalled, which didn't. The recall against me didn't succeed, but they thought it was going to succeed, and they were doing, all but breaking out the champagne. So it's the exact opposite. But my point was going to be that if Mamdani was actually a fighter, then I do not imagine that Hochul would have endorsed him. But also, you have to think about it from the other point of view: is that when somebody is it's right. The writing is on the wall. He's going to win. He's going to win big, and he has become an international celebrity, and he has just basically put a check on the Democratic establishment at that moment, and he's about to win the election. Why would he care about Hochul's endorsement? See, this is what I mean. So, I don't think it is. I don't think we need to characterize it as cynical or anything like that. It's not. I don't see this as a personal, emotional response. This is political analysis, and my political analysis forces me to ask these questions. Like, wait a second. If he doesn't need Hochul's endorsement, then why is he parading her at his rally? And why and how is she so bold? If she needs him so much, how is she so bold that after attending the rally, I don't know if you saw this, Brianna, I'm sure you did, but she was interviewed by somebody. I can't remember exact quote, but she said that person asked her, so are you now, because it was, people were chanting tax the rich at the rally at Hochul, because ordinary people do want her to tax the rich. And the interviewer asked her, this was a corporate media person, I believe, that, so are you now for taxing the rich? And Hochul, she said something like, it's going to take more than a rally to convince me of that. So she has not budged a centimeter. She has not budged a fucking centimeter on this pivotal issue of taxing the rich. But here you have Mamdani giving her his credentials, his blessing in spades. So no, that is not using leverage. That is a person who is eager to be part of the establishment. This is why I'm saying the framework matters, because if your framework is, oh my God, I don't understand why he's doing this, then you can't answer that question because it seems eternally puzzling. Like, why would he do that? But if you understand that he was never intending to do what we think he should have done, and anything close to what we did in Seattle, then he wouldn't be doing these things. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's Occam's razor. At the end of the day, what is the simplest and the most straightforward explanation that will tell you why is he doing this? If he doesn't need Hochul's endorsement, then why the fuck seek it in the first place? And if you have all this going for you right after you've been elected, then why are you giving your endorsement back to her for free? Why don't you hold a press conference and say, I'd be willing to support her if she is willing to come out and say tax the rich and promise that she will tax the rich. He could easily do that. What I will add is that what's similar about his campaign last year and the Bernie Sanders campaign, especially 2016, and what's different about those two campaigns versus all these other supposedly progressive campaigns is that they actually ran on the demands. So that much is true, that they specifically made the demands the center of the focus, and that is something we agree with. And I said that last year, that I agree with Mamdani doing that. But I also said that I don't think he's going to do much beyond that. And you could see that even at the end of the primary. He had won the primary, and after he won the primary, remember, he became just an absolute, front page news internationally. And I think a few days or a few weeks after that, the Rent Guidelines Board of New York had a meeting, and they actually increased the rent. Can you believe it? Rent freeze is his demand. And they increased the rent while he was running for election. So I asked, and I asked this publicly, why isn't he claimed to have 100,000 supporters. Let's say there were at least 50,000. Why isn't he mobilizing tens of thousands of people outside the rent guidelines board meeting and shutting the meeting down and refusing to let them allow having the vote to increase the rent? I mean, it's a very simple question. And so, yes, he ran on good demands, but I didn't believe that he had any follow through. And unfortunately, much of it is being proven true.
Yeah, not to mention, and maybe it's worth doing an episode on this with some of the local housing experts who know more about this. But friend of the show, Kate Willett's certainly been tweeting about this a lot. The sort of seeming capitulation to certain private public housing partnerships in New York to build more housing units, the defense of homeless sweeps in the city that, have had the effect of getting, it's like the tail wagging the DSA dog. You have DSA members supporting and voting on supporting actions that it's very difficult to imagine they would have supported if it weren't in defense of Zohran Mamdani. And I do worry that so many leftists being brought into his campaign as well has neutered avenues for knowledgeable criticism of Zohran Mamdani. So many people who I would normally call upon even to come on the podcast and speak to what's going on and help us understand it are, unable to do so because they're a part of the administration, are sort of being made complicit in all that's going on. So, it's a very difficult position to be in. You said you wanted to talk more about what's going on with labor leadership in the country. Before we do, I wondered if you would just indulge me in a couple of sort of newsy items that might be top of mind for folks. I want to get your thoughts on how the Epstein file releases have been addressed, ignored, misrepresented, weaponized, exploited, not sufficiently exploited by the Democratic Party. Most recently, as we're recording this, there was a pretty remarkable article written in the New York Times titled "The Epstein Files Should Never Have Been Released" by a former federal prosecutor named Daniel Richman. His argument could be summed up in a paragraph toward the end, in which he says, when materials collected in a criminal investigation get released in bulk for public consumption, the justification for the coercive and privacy invading tools we give investigators gets a lot weaker. Institutions claiming to protect user or customer privacy might be more likely to resist valid use of those tools. Witnesses who would otherwise speak to investigators about sensitive matters might start to rethink whether they want to provide grist for internet searches. Generally speaking, it's a critique of the idea that victims have their privacy impeded upon, but also that there's a sort of finger-pointing game of guilt by association that would do unfair damage to the reputation of folks implicated by the Epstein files. And that tone is not a unique one that's been taken in some quarters of the liberal establishment. You've also seen a sort of selective focus on Trump and other conservatives' implication in the files and not members of Obama's own staff. For instance, Catherine Rumler, is one of the people whose names come up most in the files. People like Tom Pritzker, the cousin of Illinois governor and future presidential hopeful, and the like. And of course, the lack of accountability or further investigation here in the United States, whereas abroad, we have seen certain powerful people been brought to account. What is your perspective on the Epstein files so far?
First of all, just to talk about this guy from the New York Times, Daniel Richman, I don't agree with that point of view because it's premised on this idea that if we didn't publish, if these details weren't published, and then the courts, that it's premised on the idea that if these details weren't published, the courts would actually take action and then painstakingly go through all of the files and file all the charges against all these powerful people. It's like a veritable who's who of the capitalist class that is implicated in the Epstein files. But that premise is completely crap. That's not how capitalism works. The court systems, the police, all the other institutions of the capitalist state, they exist in order to protect the capitalist state. There was no, I don't imagine that there was any scenario where we could have had a reasonable expectation that some of these powerful people would be held to account. In fact, I would say even further that even after all these scandalous details have been published and now they are known by hundreds of millions, probably billions of people, even now, if you asked me, is your expectation that, is it statistically likely that these powerful people will be held to account? No, I don't think so. I don't think that most of them will be held to account. Most of them will not face consequences. So I absolutely think it was the correct thing for these details to be revealed. And and the bigger purpose it serves is for ordinary people, working people to understand that this is, and in fact, they don't even need to be explained. Most working people I've talked to, their response is that they're completely disgusted. They're completely just, it's stomach turning. It's absolutely stomach turning what this represented. And at the same time, they're not exactly shocked. They're like, yeah, we know this stuff goes on. The rich never pay a price, and the rich have a sense of entitlement on every aspect, whether it is you're talking about land and area, or money, or political power, or their control over women's bodies. I mean, all of this, the misogyny, all of this is part and parcel of capitalism. And I think that is the most important point we have to explain, that actually the fight against sexual violence has to be tied, and pedophilia has to be tied to the fight against capitalism itself, because it's this type of system that breeds these evils, and you can't fight against one without fighting against the other, because it's integral. Just like racism is integral to capitalism and class society, we have to understand that the fight against sexual violence will take a fight against the billionaire class itself. So I think in that sense, it's been extremely useful for people to understand that, oh yeah, these billionaires, they think that they're above any kind of accountability. They think they can get away with it. I mean, when you have even people like Deepak Chopra writing that God is a construct, cute girls are real, in an email, it shows that he believes himself to be above any account, because he wouldn't. I mean, I don't think people like him are stupid. They are writing these things because they have 100% assurance that they will never be brought to book for any of those things. That is why these emails even exist in the first place. That is why these disgusting photos exist. And to be honest with you, I've not looked at all of it, because it is very, 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 very hard to look at everything. But my point is that that documentary evidence exists because all of these people thought they were above any kind of accountability whatsoever. And let's not forget, the Epstein files could have been released by the Biden administration and by the Democratic majority in the US Congress in 21-22, but they chose not to. So it really shows that they are all complicit. And you're right that the media and the Democrats themselves, they tend to focus on all the associations with Trump, which obviously are truly disgusting, but they're not. But they're trying to make this as if it's a Republican issue. No, it's not. It's an all capitalists are, motherfuckers issue.
I mean, not just capitalists, perhaps. I do wonder what you make of Noam Chomsky's inclusion in the files.
Yes, no, I'm glad you brought it up, because I was going to say something myself. Yeah, I think it is a reminder that that for us on the left, it is super crucial to understand that some leaders, and right now, and we're coming to this topic, labor leaders, men, and also intellectual leaders, they will themselves play the role of gatekeepers, because they have decided for themselves what is good for their own careers. So, I mean, first of all, if you look at just the documentary evidence of Chomsky's associations with Epstein, they are horrendous. I mean, he has had a long association with him, even after his 2008 Epstein's 2008 conviction. Sorry, yeah, I was forgetting that word. Yeah, conviction. And so, I mean, it is just beyond the pale. Like, there isn't any possible excuse Chomsky could use to explain away his association especially after 2008. But even that is letting him off the hook too easy, because the question also should be asked before 2008. And obviously the issue, the position that Chomsky took, where he used the word hysteria, like this is all, like, all these accusations against Epstein and his associates about this massive pedophilia ring of preying upon underage girls. I mean, just in the most gruesome ways. That is, first of all, characterizing that as hysteria shows that Chomsky is completely off any political compass on that issue. I mean, it is completely off any political compass. There is no justification, there's no explaining away, there is no rationalizing it, there's no justifying it. But it is not even just that. The question that myself and many of the people I've talked to are asking, what was Chomsky even doing associating with somebody like Epstein and people of his setting? Like, you're supposed to be somebody on the left, and you're treasuring associations with people in the billionaire class. No, what the hell? What the hell were you thinking that whole time? Even if you didn't know the facts, which he did, but even if you didn't know the facts about what was happening to those exploited women and girls, what how can you rationalize the fact that you were so closely associated? And then I don't know if this is a quote, but I think Chomsky or his wife tried to justify it by saying, well, I used Epstein to manage my estate. And my first response was, so you have an estate that needs managing? Like, I don't have an estate, and I don't plan to build an estate, because that would be part of my sellout, because I'm here to fight for working people. If I start building my estate, that is part of my betrayal. That is part of why I've taken only the average worker's wage. It doesn't mean that people have to take a vow of poverty and show lifestyle sacrifice. That's not the issue. The issue is, are you firmly within the actual life of the working class, so that you keep yourself accountable? That's the question. And certainly having an estate that needs to be managed by somebody who's associated with billionaires, I don't think that qualifies as anything in touch with the working class. I mean, that itself puts Chomsky completely out of touch with the working class. But one other thing I will say also is, and this is how gatekeepers, this is part of the mechanism by which gatekeepers get created, Brianna, is that they trade on access. And I'm not the first person to say this. A lot of other commentators have said, Chomsky traded on access. And I think there's a certain, that is a good explanation for that, because he says, Chomsky said in his own words that, Epstein allowed me to meet various people. But why did you want to meet these people? I am not looking to meet these people.
Woody Allen and Steve Bannon. And
yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I do not, first of all, yeah, Woody Allen, disgusting. I would never want to, Steve Bannon, like, what on earth is Chomsky doing wanting to meet Steve Bannon and wanting to have continued, like, over a period, continuing to have association with them? And then the most outrageous, perhaps, is his association with Ehud Barak. I mean, how can you claim to be pro-Palestinian and against the Israeli occupation and having the correct position on this extremely crucial issue in global politics, to then say that, oh, I wanted an access to Ehud Barak? Like I said, there is no justification. There is no rationalizing away of this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've now talked about this with several people on the podcast. I talked to Emil Torres about it prior to the most recent big drop at the end of last year. I spoke to Gabriel Rockhill about it in the context of his writing about the sort of fake left who derail movements in these subtle ways, who are propped up by the establishment to be a sort of a compatible left to capitalism, but I don't know. I spoke to Chris Hedges about it in an episode that I'm planning on making public in full, if it's not public already by the time people listen to this, because it was such an important conversation. And I sense a sort of almost reluctance. There's no reluctance in condemning Chomsky and his association with Epstein, but so far I haven't really heard folks dig as deeply into what the potential implications might be for Chomsky's substantive politics and how, if this association sheds light on some of the political choices or stances that he's taken over the years. And obviously, I'm a dog with a bone with this particular issue of Vote Blue No Matter Who. But that was my only sort of personal experience with Chomsky, him coming on this show for episode 10 of Bad Faith Podcast. Now we're on episode 500, God knows what. But it was very early days. And, in the context of Gabrielle Rockhill and talking about the compatible left, it did leave me sort of wondering, am I less surprised, frankly, by Chomsky having been a part of this world, given that he did play the role of being propped up by the establishment every 4 years? People who ignored him and hated him every other moment in time would start quoting him to tell people to go and vote for a Democratic candidate around election season. Is there any connection there? Is that a stretch? Or is there some relationship between his comfort with the establishment and that particular political choice and maybe some others?
I think there is an absolute connection. I'm glad you brought this up because I've been thinking about this as well. And I don't think the two things can be unconnected. Again, this falls under the category of we don't need to be mind readers of Chomsky to understand this. This is just it's a very straightforward political analysis that political positions don't exist in a vacuum from a given political individual. There's going to be sort of a synthesis. There's going to be a common thread in what generates a certain position you might have. The position I would have as a revolutionary socialist there'll be a certain logic to that. You would know that this is why I have this position. So you're absolutely right, Brianna. There is the what's been revealed about Chomsky through his association of Epstein does not exist by itself. It is actually not. I mean, obviously, it's shocking, and we shouldn't act like it is. Oh, it's like, oh, we shouldn't get in the business of explaining it away. It is absolutely unacceptable. But at the same time, as you're alluding to, it's not completely out of place with the positions that he has taken. I mean, yes, has he provided a lot of analysis about, his whole work on manufacturing consent, all of that. Was that useful? I mean, I think, you'll agree with me that a lot of people who have come out courageously against, criticizing him for what's happened with the Epstein files have said that actually, Chomsky was one of my earlier in my formative years in politics, responsible for me to help me forming a political thought. And that's true for a lot of people. And his thesis on manufacturing consent is a big part of that. But it's totally ironic. It's totally ironic, Brianna, that he himself has become the cautionary tale of what he was telling us to pay attention to. One of the quotes from Chomsky is, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. This is from Chomsky. And is the substance of that accurate? Absolutely, it is accurate. This is why it's such a struggle, when people have illusions of the Democratic Party, this is part of our job to explain that they're actually both representatives of capitalism, but it serves the interests of capitalism to make them look different, because then you'll think that there is a debate actually, and then, forever, the goal of the capitalist class is to keep you oscillating between these two, which are completely tied to the interests of capitalism, and give you the illusion of debate, as he says. So, but Chomsky himself has become an example, or was always, it's just been more revealed now through the Epstein files, that he himself was an example of that people will engage in their own form of self-censorship in order to keep, like I said, access. So if you are the kind of person who wants that access, which Chomsky clearly was, then you're going to make those compromises, and you are accountable for those compromises. And so if people criticize you for that, then that's, you asked for it. And if you don't want to do that kind of sellout, then you don't look for that access. You do what we do, which is absolutely squarely understand where the class lines are drawn, and then have an unshakable allegiance to the working class. You can't, you can hardly claim that Chomsky has done anything like that. And actually, there's a logic to all of this as well, in the sense that I don't know if you remember, Brianna, but he was against force the vote. In fact, he spoke quite mockingly about the whole force the vote idea.
Mm.
And
I think, did I talk to him about it on the podcast? I can't even remember now. I have to go back and listen and clip a little bit of him on force the vote in, if in fact I did bring it up with him.
Something else that I wanted to ask you about, Professor, and I don't know how much, if at all, you pay attention to the online leftist community, but one of the more fracturing and extremely divisive debates in recent memory occurred over this idea called force the vote, which sought to pressure progressive congresspeople into using their leverage to essentially threaten Speaker Pelosi's reelection, and as a result, potentially get some policy concessions, or at very least a floor vote on Medicare for all. If you paid attention at all to this debate, did you have an opinion on the strategy? And do you think that elected progressives, congresspeople like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ro Khanna, who believe in policies like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, have a responsibility to be fighting to push President Joe Biden and his administration even harder by using their leverage in instances like this, or to hold up key bills in order to get policy concessions?
Let's take a look at the real world, not a dream world, the world we live in. Suppose you manage to push Pelosi to say, let's have a vote on Medicare for all. And in the Senate, push Schumer to have it. We know exactly what's going to happen. 50 Republicans will vote against it. A large number of Democrats will vote against it. 2, certainly. Manchin and Sinema, probably plenty of others. So what we're saying is, let's do something to be defeated. Is that a strategy? I mean, it's nice to say, I want this, but we're not children who say, I want this piece of candy. I'm going to ask for it, even if I'm going to be locked up in my room.
But what remind us what you recall him saying at the time.
I don't remember the exact words, but it was similar to what AOC was saying, except I think he was even more mocking about it. Like, well, this is such a waste. Like, it's the attitude he had. Again, these are not his words, but the attitude he had was, all these silly children on the left, they just don't understand what is going to be strategic. And I completely disagree with that. It absolutely is the strategic thing for us to do. Us, meaning those of us who are fighting for the working class, we have to use every leverage that's at our disposal. That is the strategic thing to do. And when somebody tells you, whether it's Chomsky or AOC, that it's not strategic and they mock you, what they are doing is announcing their own corruption, that they themselves are not willing to cross that line, because if they cross that line, it will be what AOC said in her famous, rare, honest words, the reputational and relational harm. She was dead right about that, as I've said before, that if you cross that line, you will become enemy number one, as I am, of the bourgeois. But you have to welcome that, because that is what it takes to fight effectively and win for the working class. And when you have leadership, whether it's in labor or in NGO organizations, whether social movement like BLM, or progressive Democrats, or intellectuals like Chomsky, when you have leaders who are not willing to cross that line, that is the moment of selling out. And selling out it doesn't just look like outright, like, it's not like Chomsky made $1 billion or AOC even made I don't believe that they're billionaires or anything like that, but they are selling out by being willing to become those agents, the agents of gatekeeping. That is what they do. So their job is to then go and mock, force the vote, make people feel like, oh, this is of no use, let's keep our powder dry for 15. And then when the 15 chance comes up, then again you sell out, then again you have a new fresh excuse. Oh, it's the parliamentary, what was it?
The parliamentarian.
Like, I didn't even know. Like, we're all engaged in American politics for decades, and we never knew of the existence of the parliamentarian. But all of a sudden, this parliamentarian is going to decide everything. And oh my God, we cannot fight for 15. And the federal minimum wage, the national minimum wage, is still at a disgraceful $7.25, and the tip minimum wage is $2.13. That is what you get for leaders being gatekeepers and traders in access. And if you don't want that, if you actually want victories for the working class, if you want the national minimum wage, as we are calling for through my congressional campaign, to go up to $25 an hour, then you need our approach where we don't trade in access. For us, it's about an unshakable loyalty to the working class, and that means fighting in every way possible and recognizing actually that if you are not in the cross, I mean, it's a rule of thumb, okay? It's a rule of thumb. It's not everything. It doesn't tell you the whole story, but it's an indication of the highest order. If you are not in the crosshairs of the ruling class, then you are not actually doing what it takes. Because if you are, then you will be in the crosshairs of the ruling class. And just to offer a comparison and also pay tribute to Michael Parenti. I mean, not that I agreed with Michael Parenti on every single thing, but that's not the issue. The issue is that he didn't sell out. He was true to his position. And I watched an interview of his son, Christian Parenti, a part of it, in which I was shocked to hear actually that apparently Michael Parenti was so much in the crosshairs of the ruling class that in 3 separate universities, he was denied tenure, even though obviously he was super qualified. Even when the department and the head of the department and his colleagues, everyone wanted him, the board of directors of the university intervened and said, you can't hire this guy, you can't give tenure to this guy on 3 separate occasions. That's shocking. I have never heard of this happen.
Yeah, it is shocking. And the New York Times, speaking of the New York Times not being exactly covered in glory, their eulogy, or whatever you call it, when he passed away earlier this month, was basically just a hit piece. It was titled "Michael Parenti, unapologetic Marxist theorist and author, dies at 92." The subhead is "A prolific writer and lecturer, he viewed U.S. history through the lens of class struggle." I think they mean that as an insult. But some accused him of defending brutal regimes. Some accused him of defending brutal regimes in the Soviet Union and Serbia. It goes, Michael Parenti, a Marxist political theorist with uncompromising views who published more than 20 books and lectured widely, but was accused of being an apologist for brutal regimes, including in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, died on January 24th in Amherst, Massachusetts. He was 92, skipping ahead a little bit. He was convicted of striking a state trooper at an anti-war protest in 1970. He ran unsuccessfully for Congress in Vermont in 1974 on the same third-party socialist ticket as Bernie Sanders. In Mr. Sanders' first bid for the U.S. Senate, an unsuccessful one. I mean, don't bother eulogizing me like this when the time comes. The less said, the better, I gotta say. But speaking of, you were just alluding to this idea that if you aren't in the crosshairs, you may be, not causing sufficient ruckus, to put it in AOC's terms, or at worst, you're complicit. AOC has been in the news in the last week or so for 2 reasons. One reason was her performance at a conference in Munich where she was being assessed for her foreign policy bona fides in anticipation of her running potentially for president in 2028. Polls seem to suggest that she is, in fact, a front runner, potentially, in 2028. And this, therefore, was a sort of a testing ground for her ability to hold her own. The performance was roundly considered to be a bit of a flop, specifically her answer on how she would handle the sort of strategic ambiguity about whether or not America would defend Taiwan against an invasion from China came under some scrutiny. I want to play that clip and get your response to that.
Would and should the U.S. actually commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China were to move?
I think that this is such a, I think that this is of course a very longstanding policy of the United States. And I think what we are hoping for is that we want to make sure that we never get to that point. And we want to make sure that we are moving in all of our economic research and our global positions to avoid any such confrontation and for that question to even arise.
Before I get your response, I also just want to play you a more recent clip of her responding to some of the criticism she got from her appearance in Munich.
If you think that I don't understand foreign policy because out of hours of discourse about international affairs, I pause to think, about one of the most sensitive geopolitical issues that currently exist on Earth, I'm afraid the issue is not my understanding, but rather the problem is perhaps you've gotten adjusted to a president that never thinks before he speaks and doesn't care about the implications of his words before he speaks on matters like these. And in fact, if you actually look at what Trump said about this issue himself, he actually had the same, if not a worse, answer. So ask yourself, why do you think the issues turn to that? And I'm going to tell you, it's because, frankly, there are very few people who are actually willing to challenge the foreign policy establishment that continues to send people to war and bankrupt our country for the rich.
What do you make of that? Is she right that ultimately it's okay for her to pause and people made a bigger deal out of that than was necessary? And we can clip in also Donald Trump's response to that question, which was substantially similar / more of almost like a dodge of the question altogether.
So how would you have answered the question that she was asked about whether the U.S. should support Taiwan if they're ever attacked by China?
Well, I would have just said that it's none of your business right now, because I wouldn't answer that question anyway. I wouldn't respond.
This is none of your business anyway. Okay, classic Trump.
I think, actually, you know what? I'm glad you played Trump's response, which I hadn't watched, because I think it's a reminder, and which is, for me, this has been the biggest theme of, watching AOC in Munich and at the Munich Security Conference and in Berlin, and then watching all the takes about it. I think the highlight of all of this is not that, oh, she didn't do her homework and she's out of her depth. I mean, it does actually, it is helpful to show for ordinary people to see that, oh, these are all ordinary mortals. They make mistakes as well. So in that sense, it was perhaps useful. But to me, that's a much lesser point in terms of personal. I don't want us to mock her because she didn't know the answer. Because in my view, that was not what was going on. It's not like she's an incompetent. I don't consider her an incompetent. I think what was going on, and it actually shows, from what Trump was also watching, was saying is that for AOC, as you said, the whole purpose of going to the Munich Security Conference was to showcase herself as viable to the billionaire class, to the warmongering corporations, the billionaires. I mean, this Munich Security Conference is like it's a playground. It's a festival of warmongers, of weapons manufacturers, of all the Alex Karps and Peter Thiels and all the heads of state who trade in blood, and it's a place where all these powerful people get together. And so for her purpose in going to Munich was not to speak to the global audience of the working class. Her purpose was to show them that, hey, I can be your guy. I can be one of the people that you can put your faith in so that I can run as a viable candidate. And that's the whole point. If she was wanting to run as a working class candidate against the billionaire class, she wouldn't go to Munich. And I think that New York Times also, once again, for the umpteenth time, revealed itself to be again a spokesperson of the ruling class agenda, because they tried to dress it up. Like, remember the articles that they wrote before as she was going there was, she's going to go there to bring working class, whatever, talking points, and she's going to talk about tax rates. And she did. But the truth is that all of that is window dressing for her actual objective in going there, which is to make herself come across as palatable to the people who are the powers that be, who are extremely skeptical of her, not because she actually is fighting for working class people, because she is not doing anything like that. But the fact that there are expectations on her, the fact that there are illusions in her from tens of millions of American people, that makes the ruling class uncomfortable. So, by that measure, they didn't want Mamdani either. I don't think Mamdani is ever going to do what I did, but I think he's an arch careerist. But as far as the ruling class is concerned, they don't even want that. They want straight up, they want the Cuomos and the Hokels and the Pelosi's and the Schumers. That's their preference. So if they're going to tolerate someone like an AOC, then she has to prove to them her credentials that, yes, I can be your guy. And so the whole, and what was the topic there? I mean, it's the Munich Security Conference, right? This is not about, it's not a labor conference. It's not about taxing the rich. It's about showing that you can be part of the Western imperialism club. That is the purpose of this. And so her, in my view, the reason she hesitated so much on that question, and also she fumbled, flubbed, whatever the word is, on the other questions, is because she's trying to square a circle. She knows that she has to maintain some sort of semblance of an anti-imperialist position, because that is the bare minimum for a working class candidate. You know, you can't actually be a progressive or pass as a progressive if you have an obviously pro-imperialist position. But on the other hand, she also needed to convince the imperialists that she can be talked into whatever they want her to do. And I think the effort of trying to square the circle made it so impossible for her, tied her up in knots. So it was, I would say, it was not a story of personal incompetence or intelligence. It's a story of political commitments and trying to play to both sides, and that not succeeding. So yeah.
I mean, that does feel right to me. As well. Similarly, you know, you alluded to some of these other answers that came under scrutiny. She was got some flack for characterizing Maduro as a leader who has canceled elections, that was anti-democratic.
It is not a remark on who Maduro was as a leader. He canceled elections. He was an anti-democratic leader. That doesn't mean that we can kidnap a head of state and engage in acts of war just because the nation is below the equator.
You know, the kind of narrativizing that was used as a justification for kidnapping him in the first place. So yeah, I take your point that I also don't think she's unintelligent. The pausing did seem to be about reflecting on how to say what needed to be said without saying what might be more true to what she believes, but what she knows is not compatible. And that willingness to be kind of a compatible left is in fact the very problem that Gabriel Raquel has called out, and that has plagued so much of the left for the last kind of post-Bernie years, as we're trying to build beyond Bernie. Yeah. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say that I actually don't think it's correct at this point in AOC's career. I mean, she's been in Congress for nearly 8 years, to say that what she really believes in not attacking, not engaging in imperialism, but she's having to say this, or she's making herself say this. I don't believe that. I mean, in my view, it can no longer be about what she started out believing in. But at this moment, This is what she's doing. This is what she has done for years. You know, she voted for the Iron Dome. So, you know, what's left?
And to that point, another news story, it's characterized as a scoop. I don't know how much new information this is for those of us who've been paying attention. But Axios reported it as a scoop that Dems working on a secret report found Gaza cost Harris votes. This is the DNC's sort of post-mortem that they are declining to release, which someone has leaked, acknowledges this IMEU study that shows that Harris lost a meaningful number of votes because of her unwillingness to break with Biden on Gaza and support any kinds of weapons constraints on Israel, withholding weapons for Israel. And of course, AOC has became a star in the middle of that whole song and dance of pretending that Harris was a more progressive candidate than Biden when she took the stage of the DNC to declare that Harris was tirelessly working for a ceasefire. And so for me, this news isn't necessarily new for those of us who've been following Hamid Bindas, who's been on the show, and the work that he's doing at IMEU and the polling that they've been putting out since the election. But it is a sort of a recognition that this was knowledge that was held internally, that perhaps was very viscerally understood by AOC as she claimed the opposite on the DNC stage, and further goes to this point, which is that she's not a trustworthy actor in this space. And it is very frustrating. I got to say, I'm not looking forward to having my arm twisted as a leftist if she does become a candidate in 2028 and having to explain to, the generalized masses of people who haven't necessarily been tracking her betrayals the way that we have here on the left as to why I'm not excited about her candidacy.
Oh, absolutely. And let's not forget that she never hesitated when she declared on the DNC floor that Harris was working tirelessly for a ceasefire, when she knew that every word of that was a complete and utter lie. So, no, we should absolutely not have faith. And if we ended up having faith in her, we would be doing a disservice to the working class. So we would have to answer to it if we became part of the brigade that was fueling illusions in her, then we would have to answer to it ourselves. And so, absolutely, it would be completely unacceptable to create illusions in her or to further illusions in her. And really, the narrative that we need to keep emphasizing on is it's not even about her in the sense that this is the Democratic Party. So you have her on the one hand, and you have someone like Gavin Newsom, this oily, smarmy guy who is openly saying he's not going to tax the rich. He has, openly betrayed working class people in spectacular ways. But these are false choices, because at the end of the day, what did AOC do in Munich, right? Let's do a summary of what she did. She uttered the word genocide there. She uttered the words tax the rich there. But what did she actually do there? She went there to raise her profile among the imperialist class and generally spoke in favor of imperialism. She generally did. Yeah, I mean, she did not give the answer on the Taiwan issue in the way that we would. I mean, a working class representative, what they should say is that we stand against both US imperialism and Chinese imperialism in such a war. And we would stand with the working class of each country against its ruling class. We support working class and revolutionary movements in all the countries, and in both. So in this case, both China and Taiwan against their own ruling class, and that we would need in order to stop that. I mean, the question was, what would you do? So the question is not what would you do as an agent of imperialism for us, because we would never be an agent of imperialism. For us, it would be the question of carrying out general strikes in those countries and also globally against the threat of such a war, and to warn that this would cost an enormous number of lives and could even lead to a world war, and that that is such a war, if it happened, it would be part of the inter-imperialist conflict between the China-led bloc and the US-led bloc. In other words, it would not be about Taiwan, just like Ukraine is not about Ukraine. It's an inter-imperialist proxy war, but there is untold bloodshed happening of Ukrainian ordinary people and Russian ordinary people, and this has to stop. Similarly, that's the bloodshed that we would be worried about, and we have to express loyalty towards that and be very clear that neither Chinese imperialism nor the ruling class in Taiwan or US imperialism, none of these represent the interests of the working class in either country. It's not a hard answer. It's very clear. When you have a clear lens of first of all, when you have a clear analysis, scientific analysis of the way capitalism functions, and you have a clear understanding of the class divide, then you can actually formulate your thinking of what should you do in this case. But in her case, she's trying to appear as one while actually being the other. And so, yeah, it is our job to then call it out and say that this is not what we can engage in. And though we reject the choice between Newsom and AOC and Trump, we need a new mass party for the working class, and we just have to stay strong on that. And also say that is also why we believe that our congressional campaign is so crucial on a national scale, because electing the first ever revolutionary socialist to the US Congress will be the kind of shakeup, the kind of breakthrough that we need in Washington, D.C., where it is a concrete response. People are stuck between Democrats and Republicans, and genuine people will say, well, I get what you're saying, Kshama, but who should I vote for? I want to vote for one of them. Well, here's the thing. We have to break out of the stranglehold of the pro-imperialist parties, and we have to show a concrete example of that. And so electing a revolutionary socialist who is unbending to either Republicans or Democrats and showing a different way forward, mobilizing millions of people, something that AOC and Sanders completely refused to do, that is what we need to happen urgently.
So talk to me about the role that labor is playing in all of this. I know this is what you wanted to come back to. I was struck, some months ago when Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson called for a general strike. That did seem to be a sort of break from the normal establishment attitude. And even among certain corners of the left, the idea of talking about a general strike has been poo-pooed as sort of premature and fantastical and even dangerous to movements to articulate even the desire for one some point down the line. What do you make of that? Do you see anything having changed? Is that reflecting any kind of actual move in that direction? I know there's a general strike, I believe, or some planned for later this year. Is that right? There was like a May Day or spring strike planned. Is this a cause for optimism? And what are the obstacles still in place? You alluded to business unionism, union leadership very much still being an obstacle in your context in Seattle. How would you tee this up?
Yeah. So first of all, you mentioned Brandon Johnson and even others maybe uttering some statements in favor of general strike. That has happened. And your question was, does it indicate a move? No. Yeah. Does it indicate a mood? Absolutely. There is a huge mood for a general strike. And in general, if I was to describe American consciousness right now, Brianna, I would call it dry kindling. People are so ready for a fight. You saw that mood everywhere on January 23rd. You saw that in the over 100,000 people who marched in Minneapolis. The mood there, I mean, I don't know what the temperature that was on that day, but it was freezing cold. And people were there for hours on end. And they were joined by hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions nationally, including here in Seattle. There were protests. And there has been a clamoring for a general strike. I have never seen such a clamoring for general strike in my 15 years of being active in politics. But I would go out on a limb and say this is probably the most we've seen in our lifetimes. Maybe there was another time that when I was not politically active, but certainly this is one of the most, if not the most, active points where people are like I've never seen a time when it's like dinner table conversation where people are actually saying, hey, what is this general strike? Don't we need this? And all of it has to, I mean, not all of it, a lot of it has to do with the anger around the ICE terror. But it's not only that, it's all, it's a cumulative anger. Like just like BLM, the BLM protests, it didn't become the largest street protest movement in US history only on the issue of police violence. Obviously, that was the catalyst and that was the most immediate and the most dominant thing in many ways. But that movement captured class anger that broadly existed in society at that time against economic inequality and against just being treated like crap, ordinary people feeling like the system is not working. It's the same right now. The mood is obviously extremely heightened because of the anger, absolute anger nationally against ICE terror. And it is capturing the anger on all of the other issues, cost of living crisis, the complete healthcare debacle, the anger against the continuing genocide in Gaza, the support for war upon war, all of this, the anger at Trump and the Democrats as collectively, Republicans and Democrats, all of this is coming to the fore. And there is absolute mood for a general strike. But what is missing is the leadership to actually carry anything out. In fact, the labor leadership has not carried out any strike actions, even on the issue of the genocide in Gaza, on the issue of 300,000 federal public sector workers being fired by the Trump administration. Can you imagine the devastation it has caused?
What is going on?
Yeah.
How do they justify their existence in this context? Everybody is unemployed. I understand. When I ask things like, what are they saying? Like, what is their pretext? I just want to know how they're even trying rhetorically to cover for their own inaction in this moment.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I want to give some specifics using Minneapolis as an example because in some ways it's a crucible for all of this because of the thing that happened with Renee Good's murder and then the January 23rd action. But I think just starting with by saying that the way, your question is a very important one, like how do they rationalize it to themselves? They rationalize it to themselves by, and this is the hallmark of what I call business unionism, they rationalize it to themselves by their own explanation to themselves of the way the capitalist system works. For them, it is like, well, we can't rock the boat any more than these protests are already doing. And in fact, even that is making us uncomfortable because then the bosses will extract a price from us. And we ourselves, as labor bureaucrats, we don't want to be in the hot seat. We like our, Liz Schuller, the head of the AFL-CIO, she likes her $320,000 salary and she probably hobnobs in high places. She likes all of that. So careerism is a hallmark of business unionism, and careerism has a lot to do with the political analysis that people will give to themselves to explain, to answer your question, why is it that when all hell is breaking loose, how on earth do they justify their own existence, their own jobs? This is how they justify, by telling themselves that they're doing the best they can. They're certainly doing the best they can for them, their own career. This is why careerism specifically is absolutely toxic to working class movements. When you have leaders who start protecting their own careers, all is lost. That is why when we talk about having a principled approach, it is not icing on the cake or some philosophy we are spouting. We are saying this because materially speaking, working class movements reach a dead end when you have careerist leaders. And that is, as I said, a hallmark of business unionism. And that is what's happening. And so if you look at what happened, like, for example, one of the key actions that was done in Minneapolis on January 23rd was 5,000 people, activists, working people in the protest, arriving at Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport to protest against the thousands of deportation flights that had taken place at the airport. And during that demonstration, a lot of people showed a tremendous courage. There were members of the clergy who were arrested for committing acts of civil disobedience. However, contrary to the goal of the rank and file of that action, some of the lead organizers, including labor organizers, they had already worked with state agencies behind the scenes in advance to ensure that they would not actually shut down the airport or stop any flights.
Really?
Yes. Compare this to the civil disobedience actions that happened during Trump's first term in January that year, in 2017, when he, announced his executive order of his odious executive order of a Muslim travel ban.
Mm-hmm.
We were not the only ones, but we were one of the ones. We meaning my office, my fellow socialists, we fully shut down SeaTac, Seattle Tacoma International Airport, refused to allow anybody in or out we had a whole strategy with tactics of shutting down all the entrances and exits. We refused to let any plane fly. And we were not the only ones who did it. They did it at JFK and Atlanta, I believe, and some other airports. That is what forced Trump to retract his Muslim travel ban. That is civil disobedience, not making behind the scenes deals with the capitalist state saying, oh, you're not going to shut anything down. That is the antithesis of what civil disobedience is, and also what a strike is. For God's sake, what is a strike? What happened on January 23rd was absolutely crucial, and it did put enormous pressure on Trump, and we need to keep building these mass protests. At the same time, we also need to organize strike actions and a general strike, and this is what I was getting at. And for God's sake, a strike is actually shutting down the profits. You can't call it a strike if you're going to make a deal with the bosses behind the scenes and saying, oh, don't worry, we're not going to shut down your profits, because a strike is shutting down profits. If you're not shutting down profits, then what the hell does it mean when you call it a strike? You can't call it a strike. And so I think this is the biggest obstacle. So, you asked, Brianna, what is the obstacle? The biggest obstacle, this is the single most important obstacle for any progress in the labor movement, is business unionism. The fact that the overwhelming majority of the labor leadership is business unionist, meaning as opposed to class struggle unionism, which is, class struggle unionism is where you actually understand that this is class war, that you understand that this is class war, you embrace that class war, and you go to the mat for the working class, and you arm the rank and file with a formidable fighting strategy that is capable of overcoming the arsenal of strike-breaking weapons by the bosses. So, for example, how do you deal with scab workers being hired by the bosses? That's one of those things. Civil disobedience is similar to that, but a strike is more powerful because it's workers in a workplace that are shutting down profits of a workplace. And a general strike is even more powerful because a general strike is a strike across industries and across sectors in a whole city or region or even the nation. And I don't believe we've ever had a national general strike, but we've had regional general strikes. And in order to make that happen, we will first need to overcome the business unionist trade union bureaucracy.
So that's the big question, Kshama. So I've been asking this sort of provocatively for the last few weeks among in several different episodes, that given business unionism being what it is and the state of unions being what they are and union membership rates being what they are, what do you make of civil disobedience strategies that still do manage to shut down the profits? What do you make, like, how I don't mean to be asking are you optimistic or pessimistic about different avenues way, because it's kind of beside the point. You have to work to make the conditions better. But given sort of the timelines and the exigency of it all as a kind of simultaneous approach, I mean, is there any part of you that says, okay, while we're working to oust union leadership or elect more radical leadership within unions or whatever that trajectory looks like, we also have to be figuring out how to use these mass mobilizations of people more strategically in ways that do upset commerce and don't just kind of relegate themselves to milling around in preordained protest zones? I mean, what do you think of those kind of alternative strategies in support of radicalizing unions? Yeah.
No, we absolutely need mass protests. Like I said, it is the mass protests against ICE and calling with the specific demand of shutting down ICE. This is a very important thing, that the movement has reached a point where shut down ICE is the demand. And that's a demand of our congressional campaign as well. We are calling to shut down ICE and the detention centers and stop the deportations. This is the demand of the movement as a whole. That has come from the mass protests. So absolutely, mass protests are crucial. Civil disobedience is crucial, but that is why, and mass civil disobedience, it's not like individual actions, but.
No, I mean, the airport example is so instructive, but in that example, you have the union leadership being the ones that are preventing it from being, and you're telling, more impactful by prearranging for them to not actually shut down any flights.
How do you mean by more impactful? Like it's
actually shutting down flights. What you described, if I understood you correctly, having done in the past when in 2017 during the Muslim ban, is actually mobilizing to do so, as opposed to what I thought I understood you saying was that this time around there had been a prearrangement not to actually stop flights from taking off.
The leadership. I mean, I don't know who exactly it was. My understanding it is NGO leaders, self-appointed social movement leaders, and labor leaders. Probably they cooked up this deal. It's stymied the civil disobedience action. Where
So there's this irony that I'm just trying to draw out here, how to resolve it, where it seems like the action that happened without the union participation, or maybe it did have union participation, but more radical union participation back in 2017, was more effective than the one that had the union participation. So what does that mean for us focusing on unions as an avenue for change, as opposed to redirecting some of the civil disobedience to perform the role that unionized workers used to perform?
Yeah, I think it is the question. I would reframe the question a little bit, and it's not so much whether it was with labor or without labor. It's the question of was it with fighting leadership or not with fighting leadership? So in our case, I mean, I can't tell you the details of what happened at JFK in Atlanta, but I assume it was similar circumstances, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to shut down those airports. But in the case of SeaTac, when we shut it down in 2017, that was clearly a result of our revolutionary socialist leadership. There were plenty of elements there, people from the Democratic Party politicians who did not want that action. Some of them were actually calling me on the phone saying, okay, you made your point. Can you wrap it up? Can you believe this? I mean, these people are shameless. And I'm like, no, you don't order me around. I'm not going to shut anything down. I mean, I'm not going to shut down the protest. I mean, we did want to shut down the airport, but their whole point was, well, you shut down the airport now, tell your people to go home. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. You can go fuck off, So that is the despicable role that they were playing at that time. And the reason the shutdown actually happened was because of our revolutionary socialist clarity that we needed to do that. And we were not going to let any leaders sell out the movement. And you know what else happened, Brianna, at that time? So when we went there, I remember this vividly because we ended up having to leave our dogs in the car at the airport parking for hours, and they were not happy about that because at first we didn't know how it was going to go, because when we got there, there were about maybe 50 or so us. But then we started, we did this action where we started chanting and marching, sort of picketing kind of thing in the airport, and we sent messages, and there was lots of social media action. And we told people to come, and then others were telling people to come. And so thousands of people were arriving, and that's how the action started building in numbers. And we knew what we wanted to do. It was a question of whether we were going to have enough people to carry it out, and then soon we did. But while that was happening, so people were arriving, and people were using the light rail, which is the commuting rail in Seattle, in the Seattle area. And it's a very easy thing. You can take that and come directly to the airport. And so people were arriving to the airport in just train loads upon train loads. And you know what the Democratic establishment tried to do? They shut down the light rail to prevent more thousands of people from coming there. But there was such an uproar that they had to restart it. And so more and more and more people started coming in. It was absolutely glorious. And I remember this moment where I was standing there, I was about to address the action there, and I was looking down. I was on the higher upper floor, and people were on the bottom. It was absolutely glorious. I mean, just the tens of thousands of people that were there. I mean, we own the airport. That is the kind of power you have with civil disobedience and combined with strike actions. I don't think we should pit one against the other. We need both. But the point is that regardless of which one it is, you need the right kind of leadership. And if you don't have the right kind of leadership, they will sell you out.
Yeah, it's not that I want to pit one against the other, but I have experienced a kind of circular reasoning when it comes to the efficacy of unions. Or you haven't done this, but others that I talk to acknowledge the weaknesses of unions at the moment and say, now is not the time. Now is not the time because the unions aren't ready, which leads me to be interested in non-union actions that are able to have the same effect. If, an Amazon worker in the context of working at a Whole Foods, if organized and unionized, could shut down the Whole Foods, but they're not organized and unionized for all of the reasons that we know Bezos has worked so hard to thwart their efforts. What could be done with the 100,000 people in Minneapolis and others who have come out to protest all over the country to have that same effect by putting their bodies in front of delivery, whatever it is, to shut down the Whole Foods, even if they didn't literally work at the store, right?
Yeah.
In the way that you did at the airport, right? You didn't need the TSA agents or the airline employees to do it. You guys were in there just doing it.
Yes. No, I get your question. It's a very important one. In fact, it relates to why we're running this congressional campaign also, actually, very directly, because, but to start with, I wouldn't say that the union movement right now is an extreme crisis. We need a reckoning in the labor movement, in the American labor movement. Nothing short of a reckoning is going to work. And when I say reckoning, I mean that we need to rebuild block by block, have a rebirth, really. I'm realizing that even rebuild is an inadequate terminology. We need to have a rebirth from the bottom of the rank and file militancy that existed, that did carry out the Minneapolis general strike and all the other actions that gave us the New Deal. Basically, that birthed the union movement in the first place. The unions weren't created by the capitalists. They had to be wrenched from the hands of the capitalists. And the earliest union activists, more than 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago in the 19th century, they had to face actual killing and maiming of the leaders in order to actually give birth to the union movement. So we need an absolute reckoning, as I said, and a rebirth of the militancy. So we cannot underestimate how monumental this task is. But what I'm trying to draw out is to understand that is necessary, though. Doing that and rebuilding a militant American labor movement is crucial, because civil disobedience and we all agree we're not pitting them against each other. But the reason I focus on unions is because our enemy is capitalism. And the only way to actually strike a blow to the capitalist class is to go after their profit machine. And so it won't be enough to do civil disobedience. At the end of the day, there's a reason why the ruling class fears strikes so much, is because strikes are directly stopping the profits. And that is why we have no choice. If we want to save the working class, we want to save society, save humanity, then it will require working class action. In other words, it's the same people, same working people are the ones who carry out civil disobedience. Working people are carrying out strike. It's a question of what form in which you come together. So a workplace action or a general strike where industry is shut down in a city or in a nation, that goes much more directly to the heart of the profits. And that is why you find me focusing so much on the task of rebuilding the union movement. Having said that, and by the way, just to give a concrete example, the Italian dock workers forcing a general strike in Italy, that had a whole lot to do with the ceasefire. Now, the ceasefire was not adequate and there's still a genocide going on. But the point is, it put direct pressure on the Meloni regime in Italy. And it's a Trump supporting regime. It put enormous pressure on them because it's the capitalist class saying, fuck, you got to do something here. All our industry is shut down. That is what's needed. And then on top of that, we will need revolutionary movements to overthrow capitalism itself. That is what's needed. So we are pointing the way forward. And it will be remiss of me if I didn't always point the way forward there, because that's my obligation. That's what I need to do. But what you're saying and what when you were talking about other people who were saying this also, what you're noticing, which I agree with, is that the union movement is weak right now. So we are not saying, and we meaning my fellow revolutionary socialists and my fellow members of Workers' Strike Back leadership, we're not saying that we are, because that's the goal, that we are now going to just beat our heads against the wall and not have any efficacy at all by being focused on labor movement. No, that is why we're running this congressional campaign, because our question is always, at all times, what is the avenue through which we can achieve the maximum possible breakthrough for working class resistance at this given moment? The answer to that question, it does not lie through the labor movement in a direct way. Do we need to rebuild the militancy? Yes. But at this moment, what is the task? In our view, our congressional campaign is the most important campaign for the working class this year, because if we can win this election, which we have a chance to do, it will provide that breakthrough for then mass civil disobedience actions, mass strike actions, because we will have an international platform by which we can mobilize and organize working class people. We've done that in Seattle. With a small organization and one elected office, we completely commandeered the city's agenda, and we created victories for working class people nationally. It had even an international impact. It is possible to do this. And so does the road to all of this lie directly through the labor movement? No, it doesn't, because right now the business unionist labor bureaucracy is such an obstacle to that. We're not going to be able to shake that bureaucracy by one or two or individual militant. We need to build the militancy, but one or two rank and file are not going to do this. I would say that, again, what we are saying about the congressional campaign, Brianna, is not a speculative thing. This is exactly what we did in 2013. When the union leadership was telling us don't call for $15 an hour, we were adamant about it. And was it through a traditional labor movement mechanism? No, it wasn't. I was a labor union member, but we were doing it through an election campaign. And then we brought union members into our struggle, and that ended up putting pressure on the labor leadership, and it did bring them into the struggle. It forced them because they had to think of their own political reputations. That is what we do. We put a price tag, the maximum possible price tag on their political reputations. We create a situation where they can no longer pretend to be progressive. They are forced to join the struggle. They're not going to be the leaders of the struggle, but they're forced to join it. So we force them kicking and screaming. That is the potential that we have with a congressional campaign like this.
It like makes all the sense in the world, and it is insane that you're the only person that seems to be that's using leverage and trying to exact leverage and force people with the reality of where popular opinion is with your electoral campaign. And so I'm so grateful for you and that you're leading by example. Just out of curiosity, what's your opponent Adam Smith been saying about defund ICE and all of these things we've been talking about today?
Well, he certainly doesn't agree with shut down ICE or defund or even defund ICE
or abolish or
yeah, he's an arch corporate Democrat. In fact, he is trying to be performatively something a little bit progressive because he's afraid of our campaign. He's clearly afraid. Like, he spoke about our campaign on the day we launched it with our press conference, which clearly shows that he's very afraid, even though he's a 29-year incumbent. But look, he's the guy who, he's one of the Democrats who voted to create ICE, through voting for George W. Bush's Homeland Security Act. He has voted to fund ICE repeatedly. He has voted for the genocide in Gaza, tens of billions of dollars. He voted against United Nations food assistance for Gaza. This guy has never met a war he didn't like. So there is no way he's whitewashing his record, with all of his pretenses. But here's a story also that needs to be told, which is that people like him, and by the way, he also voted in December. He voted for the National Defense Authorization Act, basically approving nearly $1 trillion new dollars for war. I mean, it's called defense, but it's imperialist war is what it's for. And if Trump attacks Iran, those are the funds that will be used for that. So, Adam Smith will be responsible for any aggression against the Iranian working people. He will have their blood on his hands if that happens. He already has the blood on his hands of the Iraqis because he voted for the war in Iraq. I mean, he's been in Congress longer than some of our campaign volunteers have been alive, 29 years. A lot of them volunteering in our campaign. But here's the deal. This is the most important story that people should hear, which is that people like him who are, he's like a Chuck Schumer. There's no secret. He's an obvious Zionist, genocidal, warmongering Democrat. And up until now, up until facing us as opponents, he has never had to conceal that. He's openly out and proud, whatever, weapons manufacturers guy. Palantir love him. Alex Karp and Joe Lonsdale, billionaires of Palantir, they love him. So now, in his effort to look like he's not such a completely washed in blood of Palestinians and everyone, he is being aided and abetted by progressive Democrats. That is the role that progressive Democrats play. Like Pramila Jayapal, I believe she, how these progressive Democrats do. Every year they bring forward a Medicare for All bill, which they don't intend to ever bring to a vote. So it's performative in substance, like to begin with. But on top of that performativeness, she allowed him to be like a quote unquote co-sponsor on that bill so that he can say on paper that, I sponsored this bill. That bill is going nowhere. Everybody knows that. Everybody and their grandmother knows that bill is going nowhere. And he can continue to be bankrolled by the health insurance corporations, all these billionaires who benefit from healthcare being a crisis for tens of millions of us. And so this is the role that progressive Democrats play. People think that, shouldn't you support the Democratic Party as long as there are some progressive Democrats because they do better things and they take better votes. I'm like, first of all, they don't do better things because nothing has been passed. There's no $15 wage, there's no Medicare for all, there's not even a strong public option. They didn't even make the ACA tax credits permanent. There's no canceling of student debt. There's nothing, absolutely nothing. In fact, they've presided over a genocide. They have funded a genocide. They broke the railroad worker strike. So they're not doing better things. That certainly is not happening. What they're really doing is providing cover for the actual agenda of the Democratic Party. So we have to be very clear that we need Adam Smith to be thrown out of Congress, but this is about the Democratic Party as a whole and the Republican Party, obviously. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is that in the coming days, we should not be surprised if the Democratic Party pulls some maneuvers against me. I mean, I don't know if you remember, Brianna, but when I ran for re-election in 2019, the Democratic Party ran a slew of candidates against me, an absolute slew of candidates to try to just, diminish our campaign and just throw out. They didn't succeed. Obviously, we won the election. And then the next year we won the Amazon tax on the basis of that, having defeated Amazon in 2019. But we should not be surprised if they feel threatened enough that they run, quote unquote, progressive Democrat in the race and say, oh, yeah, if you find Adam Smith unpalatable, then here's a progressive Democrat for you. Just don't vote for that socialist, Kshama Sawant, So we need people to be clear that this is about taking on the Democratic Party and the capitalist machine as a whole. So we are running this congressional campaign. We are doing this because we need a real fight back against both parties of capitalism. We need a new mass party. And the only basis on which we will be able to shut down ICE, end all US military aid to Israel, win free healthcare for all funded by taxing the rich. These are the demands we are calling for. The only way we will be able to win that is if we have a complete alternative, like a day and night different alternative to the Democrats and Republicans, which is what our campaign represents. A progressive Democrat will be more of the same. You elect a progressive Democrat, you'll have another AOC or AOC light, goes to Munich and joins the pro-imperialist brigade. I mean, this is horrible. It's horrible to have squad members going and parroting pro-imperialist points, literally saying that, mocking the Trump administration for not ending Maduro's regime. Maduro government. They left the government intact. And she's criticizing Trump for that.
Yeah, look, if the idea of Kshama Sawant sitting where you just saw AOC sitting in Munich, I know you're saying that that's not a place that you would want to be, but the idea of hearing your answers instead of hers to those questions doesn't, tingle up your arm and make you want to support your campaign. I don't know what will. Kshama, thank you so much as always for spending so much time with us here today. Where should people go if they want to learn more about your campaign or your other organizing efforts and support you on the internet and beyond?
Thank you so much, Brianna. Yeah, people can go to, and please, I urge you to go to kshamasawant.org, my first name, last name.org, and find out campaign events. As I was saying earlier, this is a national campaign, so it doesn't matter where you live. We need you to be involved. We just had a really successful fundraiser in Hawaii and in New York City. And we're going to have more fundraisers across the nation. We have working class donors from every state in the nation and also from Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. So please make sure to, we need your support, and also you need this campaign. This campaign is for the whole working class of the United States. And so make this your biggest political priority this year. And also more immediately, we are also, and we just had a meeting yesterday, we also have resolutions and petitions for union members to take to your unions to start a real conversation about a general strike. So we the petition and resolution would be a vehicle for union members to have conversations with their fellow union members and put some real pressure on the union leadership. And we are doing this as part of our congressional campaign, showing that, this, to your earlier question, that this is not directly to the labor movement, but this is really showing the way for what we need in the labor movement urgently. And so please go to kshamasawant.org. And also wanted to say that, we've raised in this campaign already, we've raised $450,000 through working class donations. It is incredible. Yes, this campaign has real potential and it has real support from working people, as I said, across the nation. And just to say, Adam Smith's median donation is $1,000. Our median donation is $25. Working people are making enormous sacrifices in order to help build this campaign. So I urge everybody who's watching this to join them in that sacrifice, because that is what it will take. And I took the average worker's wage the whole time I was on the Seattle City Council. I've pledged to do that again. I've also pledged that if I'm elected, I will turn my congressional inauguration into a mass rally of 10,000 people in Washington, D.C., and we will immediately start building campaigns to shut down ICE and to end U.S. military aid to Israel and to build movements for free healthcare for all, funded by taxing the rich.
I have to say, I hear your call for leadership, that we need leadership, Kshama, and I hear people in the audience and people on the left more broadly so frustrated with Bernie and AOC and other people who purported to be leaders, or who we thought were going to provide the leadership that we want in the moment, who thought we're going to be adversarial to the Democratic Party and have failed at every turn. And this is exciting. This feels like a genuine opportunity to have our interests as a real left represented on a congressional platform that cannot be as easily ignored as we are here in our little left media ecosystem. So I think if you've been complaining, if you've been kvetching about the state of the world, as I certainly have been doing, this is an opportunity to have access to a real lever for change. And I hope that folks listening see this as the opportunity that it is and help to support you in this race and beyond. So thank you again, Kshama, for spending 2 hours with us here today. You've been very generous with your time.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Brianna. It's always a wonderful, wonderful experience talking to you.
Thank you. Everybody, you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, remember to keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.